to talk to you on the first paper. So we'll catch up.
Ms. Sharma, I have only 1 minute. I'm putting the poster. Okay.
Sure,
Thank you.
sure.
Bye.
I'll start in a minute. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ritvika Sharma, and I'm a Senior Resident Fellow at the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy. I welcome you all to the 5th conversation in our series, which is titled Bridges and Breaks, the Constitution at a Crossroads. So the conversations in these series are about aim is to have more nuanced as well as more accessible conversations about key constitutional developments, as well as constitutional law concepts of contemporary relevance. At the same time, our aim is to also talk about institutions and practices which are instrumental for the Constitution to work as it was intended, or even if not as intended, as best as it can. So here we are this evening, ready to embark on a conversation on political parties and the Constitution of India. To begin with, why are we talking about political parties today? Aside from the fact that we witnessed the recent culmination of assembly elections in 5 states, I firmly believe that the political party as an entity in itself has always captured the imagination of common people, of the citizens across the board. On a lighter note, political parties and party politics have forever animated many a mealtime conversation in our households. I also believe that in the present day and age, where information is rather readily available as it is, competitive electoral politics arms the voters with 2 distinct kinds of information. One about the individual candidate or the contender who's contesting an election, and also about the political party to which the candidate belongs. Against that background today, it seems rather apt to me to have a more serious, thoughtful conversation moved in the Constitution on this subject. Joining me today are 2 very esteemed guests, Rahul Verma and Aradhya Sethia. A quick round of introduction for both of you. Rahul Verma is a fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, and a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the Ashoka University. Rahul holds a PhD in political science from the University of California in Berkeley. Along with Mr. Pradeep Chibbar, he has co-authored a book titled Ideology and Identity, The Changing Party Systems of India, where Rahul and Pradeep develop a new approach to defining the contours of what constitutes an ideology in multi-ethnic countries such as India. Thanks very much for being with us today, Rahul. We also have with us Mr. Aradhya Sethia, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. He's currently studying the role and regulation of political parties and party systems in modern constitutional states. Aradhya holds the LLM from the Yale Law School, and he read for the MPhil at the University of Oxford. Most interestingly, for the purposes of our discussion today, Aradhya is one of the few legal scholars from India, I think I can say that with a lot of confidence, who have written about political parties from a constitutional lens. Rahul and Aradhya, thanks very much for your valuable time, for taking our time to be with us today. Needless to say, I'm communicated to you this to you earlier as well. I'm both delighted and excited to have you with us today. Before I jump straight into it, I would urge members of the audience who joined this conversation using the registration link to type in their questions in the chat box during the course of the conversation. We'd be very happy to take as many questions as possible, so please do chime in whenever you feel the urge to do so. Without further ado, I'll jump straight into it. In the most pristine form, it can be said that political parties function as one sort of an intermediary or a conduit between the state and the people, and act as a key instrument in the functioning of a healthy representative democracy. Healthy and representative, of course, hopefully, these are not two mutually exclusive terms. What is sometimes not given sufficient importance is how political parties can also be and are key sites of ensuring governmental accountability, given that India operates within a parliamentary form of government where parties shape the composition of the executive branch as such. Now, by virtue of this minor but rather important detail, political parties become crucial for the functioning of both constitutional structures as well as constitutional concepts in India. And when I think about concepts, I'm talking about concepts like vertical accountability as well as deliberative democracy. With these thoughts to begin with, over the next hour or so, I hope to be able to talk about some key aspects of political party dynamics and the scheme of the Indian Constitution, where I would also like to address including an apt place to locate political parties within the discourse on constitutional law in India. I would also like to talk about how political parties, as well as party politics, and we can obviously, I do not want to use these terms interchangeably, so hopefully Rahul and Aradhya will have more clarity to give here, how political parties interact and get shaped by ideological conflicts. And lastly, also about the challenges posed by and to the federal tensions that are always simmering in India at any given point in time. Aradhya, I'll turn to you first. I've had the opportunity to read some of your work on political parties and the Constitution. And the obviously striking feature in your work is your examination of political parties from a constitutional lens. Aradhya, I think it'd be very useful if right at the beginning you could set some context about two dimensions, hopefully. One is, and I take you back a historical path here, how the framers of the Constitution understood the relationship between political party dynamics and constitutional design, given that there was considerable discussion around political parties in the Constituent Assembly. So possibly that could be one prong you could discuss. The second one, if you could allude to briefly or perhaps in detail, would be the absence of the explicit constitutionalization, if you may call it that, constitutionalization of political parties. For the benefit of our viewers, Aradhya, were there any discernible reasons for that not happening when the Constitution was eventually adopted as it was? Oh, to you, Aradhya.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you
are. So first of all, thanks for inviting me. And it's particularly great to be speaking about this topic at Vidhi. Because coincidentally, almost 8 years ago, I was interning at Vidhi, and that's where I first noticed the glaring absence of political parties from constitutional law, public law discussions.
It's clearly come a full circle. I'm glad.
Assisting Orgo and others with some work on a report on electoral reforms. So, and since then, when I first noticed this absence of political parties from our public law thought, constitutional law thought, I thought, maybe Constitution doesn't say much about political parties because there is not much to be said, right? Political parties are this private associations of individuals, right? That's how we understand them conventionally. So why should constitutional law deal with them? They are informal institutions, so to speak. And I kept that thought aside for a couple of years until I did my master's, and then I realized that perhaps when I started reading some Constituent Assembly debates towards the end of my law school and realized that that's not what Indian founders were thinking. They didn't think that political parties were something that's beneath the level of constitutions, right? Constitution is about higher ideals, about higher principles. Political parties are about day-to-day politics, right? And so this quote in the final speech of the concluding speech of Dr. Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly really struck me, right? So he said, look, we have got our constitution here. What constitution can do is only establish the organs of state, right? Legislature, executive, judiciary, distribution of powers between the union government and the state governments, etc. Right? But how the constitution will really work or function will depend on political parties. And he uses the term political parties, right? He says it will be futile to pass judgment on how and whether this constitution will work or whether we'll succeed with this experiment at all, right? But we should leave it to political parties. It's not our job as constitution makers to be concerned about it. Now that quote really struck me, right? That he clearly identified that whether the constitution will work or not will depend on how political parties will operate. But it is not the job of Constituent Assembly to deal with it, or at least not the job of the constitution to have any provision in an otherwise the bulkiest constitution of the world. Right, and with so many administrative details, even about how bureaucrats will be appointed in some ways, the institution is in the constitution, so many details. And the core factor is missing in the constitution. And I'm talking about the original constitution. And I realized that most of the debates about constitution tend to just focus on anti-defection amendment, right? About post-1985. So I went back to founding, and there's some interesting discussion about how the founding of the constitution itself, right? Constituent Assembly itself was an act of party politics. The members were elected along party lines, right? 1946 elections. It was constituted especially after Muslim League members, most of the Muslim League members had left. It was a dominant party, right? There were constant arguments in the assembly going on that, look, why are you issuing whip while we are discussing constitution, right? There were directions issued by the Congress party. So the constitution making in some ways was also an act of party politics, which we tend to forget, right, when we read the debates. And these discontents were constant. Some members are coming up once in a while and saying, look, this discussion is not the real discussion. We all read Constituent Assembly debates now, and we think that's where the intention is to be understood. But the real discussion is happening within the Congress party. They come here, they have some sort of broad discussions, and they issue some, but for most contentious issues, it seems like Congress party is issuing some directions, right? It's clear that party politics is pretty much how Constitution itself was made, right? But yet the Constitution was silent. And I argue that there are kind of three reasons, right? Broadly, four reasons why Constitution makers were silent about political parties, right? Why they didn't think that Constitution should have anything to do with it. First is not India's specific factor. It's a general factor around sort of Anglo-American democracies, or even sort of democracies before the Mars franchise became prominent across the Western world. So political parties in common law, right? Whether it's UK, whether it's US, were broadly 19th century considered to be this unincorporated associations, right? They are this private contractual arrangements between private individuals. So the legal status is same as a cricket club or a tennis club, right? So you and I can come and form sort of small groups. And in London, at some point, this political clubs got formed, right? And they were running the government, so to speak. The reason you didn't need mass parties is because franchise was small. So for every member of parliament seat, or for every sort of constituency, you had 200, 300 voters or around that number. So you didn't need mass organization. Elections could be won on personal contacts. But once, of course, the mass franchise got institutionalized, right, you have mass parties coming in. And Max Weber notes this in early 20th century, that what we are now seeing is that the power is shifting from parliament to this extra parliamentary institution, right? And this shift mostly occurs towards the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century. But the law didn't move on very easily, right? The law still considered parties to be unincorporated associations. And in the UK, for instance, they are still considered to be unincorporated associations. And in some ways, many of the founders who were trained in that tradition of legal thought that, look, courts don't have much to deal with it. They are like private clubs. If there's a property dispute, maybe courts could intervene, right? But beyond any property dispute, there is no point on entering into the internal affairs of political parties at all, right? Even if there is complete abuse of power or anything. The second reason is more specific to India, which is the Congress system, right? So it's not, and I think it would be disservice to Indian founders to say that they were just influenced by Western thought and parties. They were clearly thinking in innovative terms to respond to India's specific situations. So the reason they didn't think much about political parties is also because they thought that, look, Congress system would substitute for any kind of institutionalization of parties we might want. So of course, Rahul has done some great work on this, and there's early work by Kothari on Congress system itself, that the internal system of Congress was attempting to balance between party unity and some internal reconciliatory mechanisms, right? Between different factions, different individuals in the party. So even if we don't incorporate parties in the constitution, we'll rely on Congress system. And Ambedkar kind of agreed with that in the assembly, saying that Congress is doing a good job in maintaining this balance between party discipline and sort of allowing dissenters to speak in a very limited way. But interestingly, it's in the same year, right, 1949, when Germany was drafting its constitution post Second World War. And of course, it had a major incident with what political parties could do, right, if you let them run on their own and if you don't sort of deal with them at all. And its constitution had a concept of unconstitutional political parties, and sort of laid down in the constitution that not only should political parties not aim to overthrow democracy, but they should also be, in a very broad way, internally democratically organized, without laying down exactly what that democracy means, kind of leaving it to parties in many ways as to how they want to organize democratically. Another reason is, of course, the fear of rise of sectarian parties. So there were quite interesting arguments in the founding that opposition should be given some rights. But they thought, look, if we give opposition some rights, very likely some members did voice that this opposition will not be political opposition, but communal opposition going around as a political party. So we don't want sectarian parties with recent experience with partition, etc. We don't want sectarian parties to take hold and use the privilege of opposition parties of sort of constitutional recognition of opposition parties. Another reason is also that there was kind of this fear about party politics capturing this idealistic democracy that we are constructing, right? So it's a restrained anti-partism, so to speak, right? So there's this multiple factors that came together to ensure that we are not institutionalizing parties in the Constitution. Now, first, I thought it might just be a legal thing, right? That you don't want to entrench it in the Constitution, but you will entrench it in the ordinary law. So you have election laws, which will regulate parties. You will have other kinds of laws which will regulate. Surprisingly, right? Parties didn't attract any regulation for almost for first 20 years of since the making of the Constitution, even ordinary law, right? I mean, of course, you'll be regulated by there's no specific specific regulation. Even election law, Representation of the People Act is silent on this. Very interestingly, when the provincial parliament was drafting Representation of Election Act, right? It is the Constituent Assembly itself was sitting as provincial parliament, and Ambedkar said, look, even in the expenses, right? We are only limiting candidates' expenses. Will not count parties' expenses. And someone raised an issue: why we are not counting parties' expenses? And he said, that's how it is going to work. We are fine with parties using money as much as they want for propaganda, but we just want to control candidates' expenses. So in some ways, to keep parties away from any kind of legal regulation, not just constitutional regulation, was pretty much a founding thought that continued until 85. And we can perhaps talk about it later as to what did Anti-Defection Amendment do and did not. But in some way, this is in hindsight, this is both a combination of India's specific factors and at the same time, India rooted in the global constitutional thought at that time, right? Where parties, most of the constitutions didn't have any provision on political parties, which has changed, and we'll come to it later if you want. But that's broadly my introduction for constitutional founding and Indian parties and why we don't think about that.
Right. Thanks a lot, Aradhya. That actually gives us a fair bit of food for thought for how to take this discussion forward. I have far too many thoughts. We'll speak about defection in a few minutes, perhaps. But one thing that has clearly stayed with me that you've spoken about right now, as well as mentioned in your work, is perhaps the apprehension of the rise of sectarian politics if some certain parties were emerging as some sort of having an opposition, a role of the opposition in some form. And to my mind, it also indicates that parties perhaps at that point in time in history were not just actors in an electoral contest, but also in certain social reform movements, and perhaps also in furthering certain kind of ideas as well as ideologies. Rahul, if I can ask you to chip in here, how should we possibly think about party systems from then till now, as well as party politics in India, outside of a constitutional, legal, regulatory framework? And outside of the constitutional space, I think would be very useful to perhaps also jump into the nature and magnitude of the role ideological conflicts play in political parties and political party politics in India. And how perhaps this also ties back to how the Constituent Assembly was discussing some key ideological issues. And I'm not thinking about ideological issues, perhaps how they're discussed in the West, but perhaps issues that mattered to an Indian population, like reservation, decentralization of governmental power, possibly issues like citizenship and identity. Your thoughts, Rahul?
Thank you, Ritvika and Vidhi, for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to join the panel with Aradhya today. And I thoroughly enjoyed his 10-minute intervention, the way he framed his opening sentences. The prompt which you have posed to me will require a lot of time. I will touch on some of those things, just like history of party system and ideological conflict. Some of this I have worked on, but let me basically start with something, and some of these thoughts came to me while Aradhya was speaking, is why are we discussing this issue today? Why are we concerned about political parties in India, and why are we going back to its constitutional origins, what its thoughts were, and what is the concerning thing? And I think what has happened in last 2 to 3 decades of Indian politics there are various paradoxes that are emerging. And I'll basically lay out those 5 paradoxes. In a way, if you think about, political parties are concerned with 2 key concepts, which you also alluded with in your introduction. One is the idea of representation, and the second one is the idea of democracy. And in some ways, the way political parties are functioning in our country is basically creating great tensions in these 2 concepts. In our sort of thoughts, it seems representative democracy is basically one word. They go together. But in some ways, the functioning or the empirical realities coming out of Indian politics suggests that there is great tension that needs to be resolved in these 2 concepts. And let me basically talk about those 5 paradoxes in some ways. So the first paradox is, and Aradhya said, quoted Ambedkar's line, you cannot think democracy without political parties. There is no democracy in this planet which does not have political party. So without political parties, democracy is unthinkable. In India, the number of parties that are registered has gone tremendously, increasing. At the moment, we have more than 2,000 political parties that are registered. Some 300 political parties contested in 2019. Some 35 of them entered the parliament. And so if you think of this number, where on one hand, number of political parties is increasing, but on the other hand, we are also thinking of shrinking of democratic space. There are also scholars who are suggesting that globally, we are seeing a wave of democratic recession, and India is part of that global wave, right? So, whereas on one hand, number of political parties are increasing, on the other hand, you are seeing a democratic backslide. The second thing is what we have also seen in last 30 odd years, or some of these trends may have begun much earlier, is what Yogendra Yadav has famously described as democratic upsurge of the 1990s, which is what was happening, that through these political parties, we saw participation of marginalized sections of the society in our electoral politics. You saw more Dalits and women and Muslim participating in electoral politics. But that was also a moment, and I'm not saying these 2 are linked or one is causing the other, but that was also a moment when we also started thinking or reflecting on decline of parliamentary institutions and decline of political parties, right? That parliaments are not now an effective arena of dialogue and debate, and things are being basically, streamrolled through those things. So that's the second paradox. On one hand, it is increasing democratic participation, but on the other hand, the very institution that should have been upholding or reflecting those democratic upsurge are on decline in some ways. And linked to this, the third one is that because the ambit of participation is increasing, so you have more political parties, you have more people participating, you have turnout going up, you have more number of groups contesting elections, especially after, or more number of individuals contesting elections, especially after 73rd, 74th Amendment. So India almost had 3 million people who get elected every electoral cycle. And that may be more than the population. This is just the number of people who get elected. Think of number of, even on every seat, if 5 people are contesting, we are talking about 15 million people, and that may be more than the population of at least 1/4 of the countries on this planet, right? So that's the kind of level of engagement in the political activity we are seeing in the parliamentary side of politics. But we are also seeing that many of these parliamentary activities are not able to accommodate all sorts of demands. And we are seeing spillover of those demands from the streets, right? So we are seeing far more street level mobilizations or protests in last 10, 15 years than an effective parliamentary democracy should have seen. I'm not basically saying civil society does not have role in parliamentary democracy. But the idea was that parties as channels or as institutions that link the state and citizens would be able to undertake all these grievances that are coming from the society. And because political parties are failing in their role as institutions of grievance, redressal, and those kind of things, we are seeing more protest on the street. The fourth one is, while all of this participation, more candidates, more people contesting election and all these things are happening, we are also seeing politics getting more and more captured by vested interest in different ways. And so we keep hearing about how, like, every election you'll see institutions publishing how many crorpatis are contesting and winning elections. So we know money does not win elections in India, but if you have more money, the probability of winning election is higher compared to if you are poor, right? We also know from various scholarship, the number of criminal candidates or candidates with criminal linkage contesting and winning elections. And now we have some idea, and especially my doctoral work was on this, the number of political families that operate at the local level. So we keep talking about political families at the national and state level. But if you go down below, basically parliamentary and assembly constituencies of India seem like family fiefdoms. In Uttar Pradesh, where I collected data for 50 years between 1974 and 2014, there have been 300 political families that are operating. And so you can imagine that in every district, there are 2 or 3 political families. And in some ways, they are shaping everyday politics. In fact, at some point, it seems the link between these sort of like local empires and parties basically stop at, say, district or block level. Yes, there are party attachments that voters show, and that's one arena of work I do on ideological conflict that gets reflected in party politics. But in some ways, these sort of like local level political empires shape our political arena. So these are in some ways 4 or 5 paradoxes that stand in the way of these 2 big concepts, representation and democracy, and political parties are at the heart of it. So I'll stop here, and if you want, I can come back on the other question now or later on after Aradhya reflects.
Sure. Actually, I do have a follow-up question for you, Rahul, on that. And this is something that makes me rather curious as a voter and as a part of the electorate myself. And I think I intuitively should have an answer to this myself, but again, I'm going to pose this question to you. What do you think is the voters' perception of the political party as an entity when somebody is looking at an institution of the party as such? So is it an appeal or some sort of an affinity to a party's ideology or whatever they mention in an election manifesto, or is it more transactional in the sense that, you know, an institution that gets work done, that gets my job done, that makes life easier for me? The sort of underlying thought that I am coming from here, or where this query comes from, is this sometimes apparent, and I mean, I'm guessing not sometimes, but yeah, in a lot of cases, this apparent divergence between voting behavior and maybe also electoral outcomes at the national as well as the subnational levels. So is the electorate's expectation markedly different when they are voting to elect a government which is closer to them? And I'm talking about the center state voting behavior here.
Okay, let me quickly add to these things. And in some ways, we don't have good answer on either of these questions. And this is a lack of social science scholarship where we have not given enough thoughts on both these questions. Empirical results are very poor on both these counts. So, but let me answer. I think, how do voters view political parties? All of the things you said. It's not 1 or 2 or 3. See, first, political parties are always rooted in society or social cleavages. This is not just about India, but any part of the world. That basically rootedness in society gives political parties some measure of semblance in the leaner period. Now, rootedness in the social cleavages, and this is where our scholarship has failed us, is that we tend to assume and presume that because I was born in that caste, I am more likely to support a political party. So we see this caste and party association in a very, very deterministic fashion. Whereas the way I want to think about the caste party association is in two folds. One, as I said, caste acts as a building block of political parties, as race or class does in North America or Western Europe. So the social fault lines will act as building blocks. They don't explain election outcomes, because if party wins, it wins across caste group. If party loses, it loses across class group. That's point number one. Point number two, there is always going to be some policy or what you can call as ideological affinity towards political parties. So a Dalit is more likely to vote for a BSP, or a Brahmin is more likely to vote for BJP, because these parties also cater to these groups through their policies, through their ideological platforms. A BSP is always going to talk more about what can be done for Dalit groups, and a BJP is more going to talk about, or at least in its representational logic and other things, will do something for these groups. Now, coming to your third point, now you could think of that as a logic of representation, or you can also think that as a logic of transaction. Now, right? Because, and it depends on how you're seeing it. The whole idea of representation from Hannah Pitkin to now has inbuilt this logic of transaction. You authorize someone to represent you, and that authorization and representation and accountability is in some ways transactional, right? So it's transactional in a sense that if you are not going to represent my sentiments and my interest, then I have an instrument of accountability and I will vote you out, right? So that's the accountability, unless you think of transaction as vote buying, which is people only put money, cash, samosa, sari during elections and they forget. There is very little evidence on this count that these things determine election outcomes. They are all present in the electoral politics, but do they shape outcome? There is very little evidence. In fact, even deep ethnographic work has suggested that candidates who end up spending most amount of money do not always win election. But if you don't spend money, then you are not a competitive candidate. So money signals something rather than ensuring your winnability. Final, and I can go on this list, but basically on your question about whether voters have clear preferences for national and state elections, no. Very few voters are able to distinguish, because to have that clear set of preferences, we assume that voters know which part of the government, whether national or state or local, is responsible for which kind of work, right? So for every politician, they expect vikas hoga, and from local municipal corporator to even the prime minister, they keep thinking ki hamare yahan ki sadak banwa do, right? So it's very hard to for a large section of voters to basically establish clarity of responsibility. Yes, there is a small segment of voter, and we have examples from, say, Odisha in 2019 and Delhi in 2020 and 2019, where a different party wins the national election and state election. But I think that segment of voters which are switching between state and national election is rather small, 10 to 15 or 20%. And we still don't know why they are switching. Are they switching because of clarity of responsibility? Are they switching because they like the other leader? So they, for example, BJP might not have a good leader in contrast to Kejriwal in Delhi, but AAP does not have a good leader at national level, right? So we don't know, even if there is a distinct phenomena of national and state voting taking place, what is driving that?
In fact, I think some of my thoughts behind this query were actually coming from an understanding that whether the voter, or is it reasonable to expect a voter to have a better understanding of somebody fulfilling national priorities better and possibly another party fulfilling state level priorities better. But I'm guessing that that understanding might be too nuanced. And as you said, ultimately, if the aim is Vikas who, then maybe those are questions that we are not exactly fully ready to answer at this point. Moving forward, I think one of the challenges that I feel in talking about an entity like the political party is that the conversation can sometimes operate at two distinct levels. One where we talk about ideals of the constitution, what the regulatory framework says, and then there is a more visible and tangible issue of how party politics actually plays out in reality. And a lot of that actually has come from what you just mentioned, Rahul, a lot of the things actually you've just mentioned. One possible way to reconcile both these discussions, to my mind, is to talk about discipline within the party. And here, Aradhya, I would like to sneak in a quick remark from you about the constitutional provisions on disqualification on the grounds of defection, or floor crossing, as is more commonly known. And the reason why I talk about this particular provision is because it touches at the heart of several underpinning constitutional values, such as electoral accountability as understood in its vertical form, deliberative democracy, parliamentary form of government. And I understand a lot of people think that there's a rather remote connection between voter preferences and the operation of the anti-defection law and how people ultimately end up crossing the floor. But Aradhya, what are your thoughts on how the 10th schedule sits against the general constitutional vision of political parties? And did the framing of this particular provision, the 10th schedule, not the provision, but the entire schedule, did it lead to a foundational shift?
Right. So before I jump directly into the 10th schedule, let me also see like how some of the paradoxes, right, that Rahul has pointed out might actually be connected to not to the anti-defection amendment per se, but the tension underlying the anti-defection amendment, to which it's a response, right? So first time when this kind of paradoxes emerged in Indian politics, and you can correct me, Rahul, if I'm wrong, was kind of in 1967, and that was the time when we came out of Congress dominance, right? Where in state level elections, you see suddenly many parties emerging. And you see that now you have to, that earlier, even if someone wanted to shift party, there was no other reliable party available, right? Now you have a market for defection, so to speak. And this is also the first time, right after 1967 election, that Indian political class actually first thought about political parties in any serious way. And this tension was very, very stark, right? Because at one point you have this new parties emerging, and that should be good for democracy. It's a multi-party democracy emerging. At the same time, you're seeing constant changes in the government, right? In 67, 68, state governments are changing, and there's this worry, right? That what's not only that there's a government instability, but the parties themselves are not able to form a cohesive legislative sort of groups. And once you're not able to form that, right, one might say rely on very much Burkean notion of individual parliamentarian, right, which he articulated in 1770s, if I'm not wrong, in the 18th century, right, when mass democracy was not in place. That look, individual parliamentarian carries sort of democratic or representative responsibility on its own, right? So you are elected by your constituencies, but you should have your own individual judgment, right? And one could very well go ahead and say, look, any kind of disciplining of by party is in some ways violating sort of that notion, right? Which was pretty well established in representation theory at some point. But it was quite clear, right, that in the working of constitution, we just can't adopt to that kind of purely individual parliamentarian, individual legislator you should trust their judgment kind of theory, right? And it was visible in 1968, 69, Indian Parliament established, Lok Sabha established a committee called Chauhan Committee, right, under the leadership of then Home Minister Y.B. Chauhan. And the major problem they were facing was clearly the legislators are crossing, right? But it's not just that they are crossing the parties, but it's both creating government instability, and in some ways there's also the political reality of it also, that Congress fearing that it might not be able to sort of to stop people from crossing the party earlier, which they could through the single dominant party status, right? So some of the tensions that underlie anti-defection amendment, right, was that at one point, right, you have this sort of constitutional theory of individual parliamentarian, you elect from every constituencies, but you have not come to realize there's political parties which have become mass institutions, which do organize, and sometimes people do have developed long-term loyalty towards them, right? And an interesting fascination of many of the people who are in the committee, it's a long 200-page report, is that for some reason, we have not come to understand how voters really translate their social sort of political preferences into parliamentary politics, right? So one very interesting example, and this was noted in the committee report, is that when people are defecting, right, you're sitting as a parliamentary committee and trying to articulate a response to people defecting, while when they go to their constituencies, they are garlanded and they're celebrated and their processions being taken around like, yes, you saved us, you moved from one party to another. It's like, what is this happening, right? Like we clearly think it's unethical, it's immoral, you're just defecting throughout and your voters are celebrating it, right? And one of the interesting response, perhaps way to understand is that political parties yet haven't developed that sort of ways in which a lot of this democratic demands, right, that are made to be on this, that are supposed to be made on state through this policy making processes of parliamentary institutions, when not parties hadn't yet become that conveyor belts, right? And perhaps arguably a lot of the tensions lie there, that you make policies, you make laws, you make big decisions through this parliamentary systems or through, like in post 91, many of the regulatory institutions, right? A lot of the executive institutions. But in some ways, party politics, the electoral politics, is kind of sort of cased separately, right? And you contest for votes, you win election, form government, and policy making is happening separately. So this separation between sort of electoral politics and politics about policies, right, was quite stark, that ultimately what people were contesting, were voting for, right, and what the electoral politics was happening on is who can connect the voters well to the state, right? Who can access, so individual parliamentarian, doesn't matter which party you are in, the people would trust those individual parliamentarians in many of these local places who would win because they can connect someone to the state, right? But if people haven't developed that long-term loyalty towards the parties, right, and how do they develop that loyalty is a separate question, and Rahul would perhaps be well placed to answer. But one of the ways is because parties post sort of pre-independence party, Congress party, post-independence, many of the parties hadn't yet developed those channels where how do you generate electoral sort of voter loyalty towards parties, long-term loyalties, right? That they will punish people who are crossing the floor is through participatory mechanisms sometimes, not necessarily voting or some plebiscitary mechanisms of choosing leaders, etc., right? But to have a stake in the parties when voters might be really pissed off as to why you're crossing the floor, which hadn't yet developed. And so this, so in 1985, you bring this amendment, right, of Anti-Defection Amendment, which not only prevents you from changing the party, but also voting against the party. Now, when the amendment was brought up, Times of India front page comes and says, this is the biggest constitutional amendment. This is the biggest change since the Constitution has come into place. This will transform Indian politics or Indian sort of constitutions, sort of. But it's interesting why it hasn't, right? And it hasn't because the disease that was identified by the amendments were quite accurate. That look, the crisis is not just defection. The crisis is political parties. We haven't yet institutionalized parties properly from inside, right? And what's happening is that these defectors are crossing the floor. So everyone was on with the crisis of political parties, and that's why perhaps the amendment was celebrated so much, right? One member of parliament stands up and says, "Raj, I can see," and he's not even Congress member, but I can see Rajiv Gandhi bringing the biggest amendment possible to Indian Constitution. This will change. This is a game changer. The reason it wasn't game changer is because the disease was rightly identified, not the solution, right? Balraj Murdoch in 1967, when 1969, when this debate was going on, right? He was a Janasangh MP, said, look, you are targeting defections and you're looking at defections as if they are the problem. They are just the symptoms. The crisis really is in the political parties. And why is it that political parties are not able to generate loyalty among voters, and B, not able to provide internal institutions for these members to really fight it out and still within the parties and still maintain loyalty to the parties if they lose, right? Why have we not designed those rules of the game, etc.? It's different matter that no party really ends up doing that. But this is where I think some of the contradictions that Rahul has very rightly pointed out are, and perhaps I'm using the hammer I have to beat every nail, is in many ways a crisis of parties from within, right? As to why there will be this contradictory challenges, where is the democratic pressure coming from, right? What are the democratic demands as to what really gets represented? And that's exactly where the intermediary role of parties come in, right? And Anti-Defection Amendment in some ways identified the problem rightly. It was definitely a crisis of parties, but instead of doing anything about the parties themselves, it empowered the parties to discipline the members, right? Now, discipline and party unity in itself is not bad. We have in theory, as I just mentioned, Edmund Burke said that you have individual parliamentarians, we should trust their judgment. But from 19th century onwards, you have constitutional theorists like, he was actually a journalist who wrote a book, Walter Bashard, right, on English constitution, said, look, the efficient secret of parliamentary system in the UK, and this is back in 19th century, is that you have this parliamentary, that time mass parties didn't really exist, but there were parliamentary parties, that this parliamentary parties can discipline their members, or this assembly just can't work, right? So you do require unity, right? But what is the party unity in parliament? But what is the routes that you're following, right? And subsequently, in the application of the amendment, there are many specific procedural problems about whether speakers should have power at all, given how we appoint speakers, right? But more specifically, how we have missed the chances multiple times to actually use the amendment to say that fine, parties do have this power to discipline their members, but there is scope within the amendment to also make parties institutionalize themselves a little bit, right? So incrementally, which means how do parties really decide as to what issues they will issue whips on, right? Which will be susceptible to anti-defection law. So for instance, in a case where Mayawati, who's a legislative party leader in UP, there was a vote of confidence, she issued a whip that you can't vote for government, right? And the court had a sort of an interesting issue to deal with there, which is whether you should have consent from the organizational party, right? And what does that require? So who can issue the direction, for instance, can have some implied limits on how parties should go about forming that decision of disciplining their members of parliament, right? Although the amendment doesn't say anything about it directly, right? But given how deinstitutionalized Indian parties are, and perhaps Rahul could speak a lot more, there are avenues like this, there are avenues in symbols order where, and perhaps anti-defection amendment, if we have given that concession where parties can discipline their members, there are avenues where we could use to make parties sort of at least put more thought, right? Or at least follow some process before they are disciplining their members. Just to conclude, one final avenues, for instance, the anti-defection amendment, while it was challenged, the constitutionality of the amendment was challenged in the Supreme Court, right? That it might violate basic structure doctrine. The court said, look, we'll see how the amendment is interpreted later, but any direction, the phrase any direction as to when can party issue direction should be understood in a limited way. One is that confidence, no confidence motion, or any integral policy matter that the party has approached the electorate with, right? Now, how do you understand this integral policy? What about, for instance, making parties specifically mention in the manifestos that these are the policies on which we can apply anti-defection amendment, right? So then perhaps there's again, these are very minor. The institutionalization of parties will take much more sort of institutional design questions to be dealt with. But there are minor ways in which you can make parties sort of less. No, it's not even centralization, right? It's kind of completely. We don't even know who's the decision maker in some of the parties, in the sense of you read their constitution, it's the hierarchy, the chain of authority sometimes is not clear. So that's where I try to connect that with like a lot of the problems that Rahul identified perhaps has to deal with parties failing in that intermediary rules.
This is rather insightful, Aradhya. In fact, I think the devil is in the detail, and in the 10th schedule, I feel the devil may not be in the detail, but in a lot of other things as well. Rahul, would you like to quickly chip in and respond to some of the things Aradhya just mentioned, particularly about party loyalty, about this sort of the many issues with the sort of detail that seems to be missing in the 10th schedule? Any thoughts on that, Rahul?
Okay, so let me say three things. First one is the crisis of political parties from within is not uniquely Indian phenomena. In fact, if you read the literature on parties, and especially from Western Europe since 1980s and 1990s, what we are witnessing, one is party deinstitutionalization, but we are also seeing party decline. And the party attachment is basically across the globe is going down. And in fact, that's also one of the paradoxes where in Indian case, while we don't know whether party decline has happened, or party decline has certainly happened, but we don't have any information on level of party attachment there was in 60s or 70s and now what level we have. But our participation rates are going up, whereas level of participation rates in other parts of the world is going down with party decline. So we don't know, and this is what we need to think a little bit more on. Parties might be playing very different kinds of role in a place like India or Africa versus industrialized countries of Western Europe and North America. So not only we need a new way of thinking about democracy, we also need, and I'm not being Swadeshi or anything, but basically more organic thinking on how democracies operate in our soil and how parties operate in our soil. And so, yes, we can continue to borrow frameworks from West, but the meat of the matter has to be filled from here to basically understand how they operate. Second point, and I just wanted to add many things that Aradhya beautifully laid out. There is some work, and we need more work on that front as well, that legislators, both at the assembly level as well as the parliamentary level, they don't think themselves as legislators, and neither do voters think them as legislators. So legislation or policy making is not, which is basically the way you think about their role, is their first job or first role. Both voters and legislators think of themselves as a go-between intermediary between the state and citizens. And this is well documented. So long back, Surya Prakash wrote this book in 1985, What Ails Indian Parliament? And he interviewed 100 MPs at that time. And the majority of MPs basically did not see themselves as legislators, right? And so you would continue to see, like if you compare yourself from UK or US, each member of parliament will have a whole office from chief of staff to basically someone advising them on legal matters or policy matters and other matters. And if you look, most of our MPs, unless organizations like Vidhi and PRS are providing them with interns or fellows, I don't think our politicians, very few might have these kind of aid working with them, but largely they hardly have any legislative experience, research, or they even bother about that. And this is very well reflected. And again, think about it, the amount of research that has not been done, that we have only measured, okay, how many questions they ask. But if you look at it, it's very, very skewed in terms of the number of MPs who are actually engaging in the parliament through debates or questions. And this is just a basic number. For last three sort of election cycles in parliament, most of the questions are coming from Maharashtra. 3 or 4 MPs are asking 4,000 or 5,000 questions. So basically, that's the second point I wanted to add, which is both, and which also means that not only legislators see their role differently, even parties also, in a way, not just, so there are political parties like Congress, like Left, like BJP, or perhaps BSP, who might have basically some policies and programs, but a majority of political parties which come and go, and this is the point which joins back to some of the paradoxes that I was mentioning. Among the 2,500 parties that have ever contested, only 700 have got 1% vote share just in one election, right? So 1,800 parties have not even got 1% vote share at the state level. if you look at basically 5% vote share in multiple elections, then we just have 43 parties in our 70 years of parliamentary activity. So party formation in some ways is very, very easy in the Indian case, right? So party entry has a very, very low cost, but party survival is very difficult. So we don't know about the voter attachment with political parties, but political party and politicians also don't seem to be having a lot of attachment through two routes. One, and especially in last 20 years, what we are saying is that, and this gets reflected in our parliament and legislative assemblies, most members of our parliament are first timers in any election, right? And so it means that we have a very, very high turnover of politicians who get elected. Second, the latest data also suggests, and I'm not sure whether people are punishing politicians for crossing party lines, but they are no more likely to win than an average politician. So if you switch party, it doesn't mean that you will basically have a higher probability of winning. But switching parties, as Aradhya rightly mentioned, because voters see themselves as a go-between. So if you're switching party and joining the ruling establishment, voters think now we'll have more access to the state because you are part of ruling party establishment. But whether they will vote you in the next election or not, that's not still sure. So not only we might have a problem of low party voter attachment, but we also have a problem of politician party attachment. And it can be sort of both ways. It's not politicians are just in game of power, but because party entry and party formation is so easy, we are seeing basically mobilization on very narrow sectional lines. So in some ways, it's leading to more democratization, more people basically coming into power sharing arrangement. But in other ways, it's also widening or basically deepening the crisis, which both Aradhya and I have been hinting at.
This is very helpful, and particularly for the very helpful for what I'm thinking going on from here to talk about, particularly because we started with this discussion about a couple of minutes back with party discipline and the 10th schedule. Aradhya, I'll come back to you on this again, especially now that we are on this point of discipline within the party, the 10th schedule, and how possibly after this amendment having been inserted into the constitution, there's a very, very strong case to characterize India as a party-based representative democracy, obviously. Now, in a situation where the party occupies this kind of a position in a representative democracy, how should we think about principles? We can talk about the processes as well, but I'm talking from a principle point of view on the regulation of political parties. How do we even begin to think about it? And I use the term regulation here very broadly and very liberally to include several aspects that processes and procedures that can apply to political parties. And I know I'm very unhelpfully used the term very liberally, also because Rahul, you've clearly added a lot of other things into the mix about how party members possibly, or how MLAs do not consider themselves as legislators, so how that translates to possibly their performance in the parliament or in the legislative assembly. But the short question is, purely from a principle point of view, how do we start thinking about regulation of political parties?
Right.
Yes, Aradhya.
Yeah, I actually come back to you on the same question, Rahul, in a bit.
No.
Okay.
Okay. So I wish I could answer this question very quickly, and I have responses on my fingertips. These are the 5 provisions we need. But the biggest problem in any kind of party regulation debates one is more strategic, right? Practical problem about whether this regulation could come into existence. It's the fox guarding the hen house. Any meaningful regulation has to come up with some kind of agreement among major parties at least, right? And I'll come to what could be sort of minor, small fixes, so to speak, from courts or external bodies. But any meaningful, long-term, sustainable regulation, we shouldn't expect to fix, or just regulators out of some sort of fear to fix, right? It has to come from some kind of political arrangement, which then turns into law, right? So this is foxes guarding the henhouse problem. And one of the sort of good examples is like how model code of conduct, right, which the Election Commission currently uses is not even law. but it's kind of a political morality code that all parties came together and agreed that the election commission will sort of be an umpire when the elections happen. But it's so that's one of the practical problems, right? But the second thing is that politics is fickle business, and sometimes it surprises us. And you, of course, draft many policies, and you know that policy windows open up even when you think that it's impossible policy to follow, right? That no one will ever make this change. So it's still worth thinking, right? That if that policy window opens up, right? If for tomorrow, say for some self-interested reason only, politicians sort of agree, let's actually think about internal parties. And one example is that in many, as Rahul rightly pointed out, in many Western European democracies, right, over the last 20, 30 years, sometimes parties have thought to reform themselves, so to speak, or make changes, depends on how you see it, in a very self-interested manner. They see, look, our participation is dwindling, right? Membership rates in most Western European parties were going down. So one of the ways they thought is let's open up, and it's a separate debate whether that was a good move or not. But sometimes parties also reform or make laws to in a self-interested manner. So that caveat, I think the long caveat aside, right? We do really need to think about first, right? Parties are very interesting because we shouldn't characterize them as state organs. We know that they essentially wield the political power, right? It's not, we say parliament, but we know it's basically party leaders, right? That's what parliament is for all practice, for any person on the street. That's what it means. We see federal state relationship. It essentially means problem between two party leaders, right? So it's a inter-party contest that in constitutional law terms becomes federal state issue, right? So we should be aware of that. But at the same time, right, political parties, and you in democracies, you also require political parties to not be too closely attached to state or seen as state organs. We need to give them space separately, right, outside in sort of private sphere, to be imaginative about it, and sort of sometimes not. So that's why we shouldn't immediately jump to conclusion. A very simplistic lawyerly answer might be to say, or consider them to be public functionaries, apply constitutional law to them. I would say no, right? We should stop and think they shouldn't be considered to be similar to that. So between these two balances, right, that they do play a very important role in how political power is shaped and channeled. It's essentially party politics, which defines how constitutional law itself works out, and B, that we also need to give them space in private sphere, in not to regulate. But more importantly, I think, doesn't matter where you strike the balance. An important part is whether parties are forming rules about themselves. So even if we don't lay down legislatively, right? So most parties will have a constitution, right? If you go and just check BJP and Congress constitution, they've uploaded it on their website with amendments here and there, and someone might look at the constitution and look like, fair enough. There seems to be some rules in place, right? There is at least some giving some structure to the organization. And one very interesting way to think about is that whether party rules themselves can be enforced by the court, right? So this is the minimal level that we are letting parties decide. Okay, tell us, how will you select your organizational leaders? How will you select your candidates? You design the rules, right? Because every party might need to be creative. They might figure out their own ways. So sometimes some party might decide we might want to give reservation to, say, women, right? Because we want more women candidates. That's what happened in last general election with, say, Trinamool Congress, etc. So lay down the rules, right? Lay down those rules very broadly, like who will select, right? Does anyone get to vote? And let at least law enforce the rules as a contract. It's a very lawyerly answer, but perhaps that's what you're expecting, right? That this and it happens in many countries, right? That you let parties decide the rules. You don't interfere, you don't dictate what parties should do, but at least ensure that they follow their own rules, right? And this discussion might come out soon. I might be saying as if this is some another worldly thing, that who's going to challenge a party's leadership election or candidate selection, but sometimes you might be surprised, and who knows, given all the upheaval going on in Indian opposition, we might not be surprised if at some point this lands up as a issue somewhere, right? So that's one of the ways. The second way, and which requires more creative institutional thinking, and I wish I could have a very brief answer, right? Is at least laying down minimal conditions for both for major internal party activities, and not see them purely as some gentleman's agreement within the party, right? So how parties select leaders, right? So laying down minimal conditions for parties can decide who get to vote, etc. But minimal conditions such as the leader themselves, the candidates themselves shouldn't be able to appoint their voters, right? Or even not have a voting at all, right? Even if it's just saying parliamentary party will decide the leader. We did not have organizational party. Let parties decide who they want, right? But laying down some minimal conditions for leadership election, right? Second, for candidate selection, right? Who will select candidates, right? And are there minimal grounds on which candidate selection, for instance, could be challenged in some ways, right? And parties generally see it's a very complicated matter, and we courts can't really get into when parties select, shouldn't select matters. Could there be some minimal conditions as to parties at least forced to lay down a process for candidate selection? And Rahul would know, right? So Pradeep Chibber and others have some very interesting work on when parties have internal processes in place, they're likely to fragment less, right? So perhaps more parties is not as good for democracy, and perhaps it's not even more democratic in some ways, right? That perhaps if there are fewer parties, I'm not saying 2 or 3, but fewer parties, depends on how many, could be many more than sort of Western democracy. Some Western democracies might have 2 or 3, but having more processes might also prevent sort of that kind of fragmentation, right? Third important element, as I said, because we have anti-defection law, is ensuring that parties also have internal processes of disciplining matters, right? So what are the conditions when parties can issue directions to their MPs, right? Do they have to go through some internal process and make them articulate the process? Sometimes it's not that you're dictating the process through law, but all you're saying is that articulate the process and give it to us, we'll enforce it, right? That itself, whether it be Election Commission, Supreme Court, etc., that itself might make parties institutionalize their process a little bit. Now, Rahul is absolutely right. When you not follow sort of any copy from somewhere, and 170th Law Commission report did that. It took some provisions from Germany and put it as it is. Germany regulates its political parties, one of the good jurisdictions which does it, but we can't really just copy paste, and we shouldn't do it. But we do need to think how to maintain this balance between giving parties some freedom to be creative in their internal organizations, and at the same time, right, let it not be at least not all processes should be some smoke-filled rooms, right? Or there should at least be some certainty about party processes that parties themselves are laying down, right? So this are sort of very broad overview of what could be the approach, not exactly what should be the provisions, right? that would be very anti-political if I just suggest all the because it's in a way has to be a outcome of political compromises. But that approach itself, right, that letting parties decide in many cases, but at least making some of the processes rule bound, right? One of the very interesting thoughts that I had is like how companies, right, they are private entities. They are, of course, we do want freedom of, generally we do want sort of private entities having freedom to carry out their business, and we let companies figure out their internal process, right? But no one would say that company law, having some minimum duties of directors, right, or having some minimal rights to shareholders, etc., at least in say public companies, is in some ways violative of freedom, right? We have come to conclusion that they've sometimes, at least public companies, can wield enough sort of influence and power in a different way to at least make them articulate their processes. And another sort of final point is that we also need to understand that parties operate within a party system. Not all parties should be considered. So a new entrant, which has no major influence, right, in governance, shouldn't be put perhaps through so much burden so that the entry doesn't become exorbitantly costly. But see, the established parties, right, which do have very high voting percentage, etc., which do have certain number of seats in parliament or state legislature, perhaps could be put to it, right? And think of it as, say, in competition law, we do think of very dominant players in the market, right? Shouldn't be able to, while a new entrant is given a bit more freedom in the market, right? So I'm not saying politics is like market, but as a very loose analogy. Yeah.
That's actually a very. I'm very happy that you sort of tied all of this together with when I just flung that very unhelpful question towards you. So thanks a lot for that, Aradhya. But Rahul, I'm going to come to you again with a similar question, and maybe after that we can perhaps have a couple of questions from the audience. And I would urge all of you to keep typing your questions in the chat box. But pretty much the same question to you, Rahul. How exactly should we think about, again, regulation as a concept, as a principle? And when I ask that question to you in particular, also, I'm thinking of the current reality of party politics in India, perhaps, and I'm thinking of one particular dominant party And I'm thinking of dominant party in terms of electoral outcomes here, the BJP having appeared to be invincibly having won in 2019. And so how should we think about party politics in that sort of a situation, so that the political party remains a vehicle of representation as opposed to one which furthers certain sectional or perhaps certain ideological interests? How do we think about regulation that way?
So I was very happy Aradhya took that question, because I was going to say, I don't know what to say. And especially I like the way Aradhya ended that answer, bringing the market analogy. And the reason is this. Good companies with good products last, and bad companies with bad products basically die down or decline. So you could, as Aradhya suggested, some minimalist sort of conditions that you could put in and see how it's going to work. If you're going to do many things through laws, it's likely to backfire. Politicians, those who are in the business of power, they will find ways to, they will always be 2 steps ahead of law. Right? Pursuit of power is very different in the way it operates. So, in my opinion, you could put some of those minimum backgrounds needed for who could become a leader, or how candidate selection is going to be, some more transparency. But in my opinion, in the long run, if those parties which are not being able to do all of these things will be on the path of decline, and those parties which are going to be more accommodative on these principles will be on the rise as companies operate, right? And as in market, some players become dominant players and also establish monopolies and duopolies. You will see that also in happening in politics. I think the key question for me, and I'll just shut up because that's basically like wandering here and there. I don't know what we are trying to do with this. And we keep doing this, you know, like bring in, go to the Supreme Court, ask them that candidates should be basically putting out their affidavits, telling us their criminal records and their assets. Now we only know that their assets and criminality is increasing. We were thinking that voters don't know whether politicians are have criminal records. We know that they elect those politicians many times because they are strong men and bahubalis, because they can take care of more rude and more unattentive state, and basically make the grievances of citizens here, right? So we all have our favorite reform measures, and we think if we bring in that, it will basically lead to a golden period of democracy. That's not how it's going to work. We neither have a handle on what the actually problem is, and we don't even have a handle on what the solution would be. So in my opinion, I am not as much worried about the state of our political parties or our democracy as others are, because I think it's in a way, the way it works, that over a long period of time, some of the bad things we are talking about will eventually go away, but new bad things will creep up. That's how, we are never going to establish a perfect system. We have to understand the operation and logic of democracy is going to be messy. And as scholars, my first job is to understand the messiness of democracy rather than making it a perfect democracy.
Thanks a lot, Rahul. That's a solid pivot to the conversation that we've been having, and I think this might be a good time to take a couple of questions from the audience. Rahul, this one's for you. So we have a question this is a switch from the party as an institution to the party as a first responder to the will of the electorate. And the question says that given that some of the benefits, particularly with respect to stability, that accompany proportional representation systems are not present in India, what exactly is party politics responding to? And if it's possible, Rahul, perhaps we can also approach this question from a federal angle. So are parties responding to the need to have a more widespread national coverage across states? Or are they looking at accommodation of interest of a wide range of groups or communities in India across?
Okay, I think Aradhya is much better to answer these questions. As he mentioned, parties at the end of the day, what you can think of federal or national, it's basically a contest between two leaders representing two different states. Yeah. At the end of the day, these are two ambitious politicians in their pursuit of power. Right, and sometimes that pursuit of power will make them cross state boundaries and go national, as the Aam Aadmi Party is trying to do, right? And it's difficult, and it's not that those who are not crossing boundaries, they are being basically less ambitious or are being benevolent and they want to be in their own regions. Parties bear the mark of their childhood. So certain things that you do in your course of your childhood will also become constraints in adulthood. And so that's why many parties face great hurdles crossing their state boundaries, because from their inception, they push too much of regional politics, right? Or use what you will call as regional sentiments or regional platform to mobilize, and that basically becomes a hindrance or obstacle when you try to cross one state boundary going into the other. The first part of the question, and it has two things. What are parties? It depends on how you look at it. You can think of parties as will of the electorates, or you can also think as parties as channels or vehicles of elites to pursue power in democracy, right? And it's not either or. Both things go simultaneously. As a leader or as an elite who is trying to pursue, is in pursuit of power or become something, will have to, at the end of the day, reflect or at least convince a large section of the society that it's working in their interest. Otherwise, why are they going to align with them, right? So you, as a politician, will have to convince a large section of the society that you're representing them. In some ways, Aradhya will add to this perhaps, the term party comes from a Latin verb, which means part or to divide. The job of political parties in their pursuit of power is to continue making divisions in the society so that they can create majorities for themselves. And so, yes, as we both have been hinting at, that institutions like party systems, which are informal or formal institutions like electoral system, as you hinted about proportional representation, they are going to both create opportunities as well as constraints on how parties are going to operate in that system, right? And sometimes, as we were discussing for the previous question, there could always be a window that may open where political parties can say, okay, now let's change the system. But when would a winner will first try to change the system, especially because the system itself, so like for last 7-8 years, the demand has been of thinking about a proportional representation system. But why should a BJP be the first mover to change it from FPTP to a proportional representation? Remember Vajpayee saying the same thing in 1996 when the first time they came to power, that yes, we were also making the same demand in 1960s and 70s when we used to get 10 or 11% of the votes, but just 3%, 3 seats in the parliament. Right, so it's like really hard to convince winners to change the rules of the games once the result of the game is out.
Aradhya, would you like to chip in? I see you smiling. Please do.
Yeah, well, one scenario in which winners might want to change is when they're kind of aware that they're going to lose soon.
Yeah,
as an insurance for being the losers, right? Or as to create roadblocks for the future winners. So I agree with Rahul that political reform is particularly difficult to achieve, right? It's like hydraulics, as one scholar in campaign finance in the US said, power is like water, it flows, right? So it's how many barriers can you really erect? Anyway, so apart from that, I think there's not. So I agree with Rahul that it's whether parties grow outside sort of their own limited regional identity depends a lot on how they themselves have framed, right? And sometimes it's difficult to come out of that. But very interestingly, perhaps an interesting issue to think about is how the national parties, right, cater to sort of different state demands. Sometimes they are contradictory, right? So for instance, so think about it as like a dominant early 20 years dominant party system in Congress. And I think Stanley Kochenek, if I'm pronouncing his name right, of is like, wait, there's a constitution working in this one party dominant state, right? So he comes to India, studies Congress party, tries to understand how really constitution is working. And what he figures out is that most of it is working from how state units of Congress party is negotiating with the central unit, right? And many of the sort of issues, the regional issues were sometimes within the party, the different units of the parties themselves negotiating. So perhaps one way to think about is also, for long we have thought about sort of federalization of politics as a sort of tussle between the regional party and the national party, so to speak. But I think increasingly it's going to get internalized within the parties, and parties will have to address questions to also create sort of structures within themselves to figure out those processes, right? Between their state units, for instance, and the national unit. But apart from that, I mostly agree with Rahul. I can only be envious of Rahul's students at this point with all the experience. So.
I think we all are at this point, but thanks a lot for that, Aradhya. Just one last question before we close this discussion, because also we're sort of overshot time at this point. So we briefly touched upon this question of center-state relations and party dynamics already, but just one last question from the audience, and I think it might be useful to close the loop on that by briefly alluding to the office and the role of governors. I know we've sort of traveled a long path here, but yeah, just a couple of parting thoughts on how far removed are the politics of the times from the constitutional vision when we consider the office of the governor, and how that sort of is impacting quality of democracy at the subnational level, and that the whole office has become a bit of a plaything between state level politics and national level politics, particularly when there are different parties in power at both these levels. Any thoughts on that, Aradhya? And perhaps we can close with that.
Right. So very quick thoughts about that is, I mean, Constitution, at least in the debates, it was very clear when we were making this institution. It was not that they didn't envisage this wouldn't happen. It was very clearly envisaged that, look, right now Congress is the dominant party. It might not be an issue, but once it's not a dominant party, there will be an issue. And that since the emergence of multi-party politics, especially since the third party system, when you have many more regional parties coming up, we know it's a constant issue of using the governor's position regularly. So I think one way to think about it, if we at all are thinking in terms of any institutional design, and this might be cross-party over long term, right? This short-term fixes are going to Supreme Courts, creating those principles. When can government take confidence votes? How many days? Perhaps court could lay down more specific principles about how many days, for instance. Some people say there should be a time limit on how much time can governor give to anyone to prove the confidence. But if you want to really think in larger terms, then one way to think about the office of governor is how to have multi-party representation in the appointment itself, right? So if governor is someone which who's appointed not through sort of as sort of an agent, or so to speak, of president, right, appointed by the president directly or serves on the president's pleasure, but actually coming to terms with the reality that neither president nor governor are some sort of above politics figures. They are all tied to party politics, and they are all partisans in one way or the other. If we come to that sort of realization that parties shouldn't be silent within the working of constitution, then perhaps one way to think about it is, like we do with some other anti-corruption institutions, is to think of governor's position itself as something that could be, the appointment itself could be dealt with in a multi-partisan way, so that there's some agreement about who's getting appointed and no one feels that they serve on the pleasure of one party. But again, that requires an institutional fix. Is not a short term going to Supreme Court.
Any parting thoughts on that, Rahul?
No, I think Aradhya said it, what I would have said. So, yeah.
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot, Aradhya, for that. And thanks very much, both Rahul and Aradhya, for being with us for this discussion today. I think I go back with both uplifting as well as some very sobering thoughts about party politics and political parties in India. So thanks very much for that. I had the most fascinating time speaking with you today, and I think I speak on behalf of everyone in the audience when I say that this was an exceptionally thought-provoking time spent. Personally, I'm going back with a bit of a reading list also based on a couple of citations that you mentioned during the course of the conversation. So thank you very much for that. Many thanks to everyone who took the time out to join us in the audience today, both via the registration link as well as Facebook and YouTube, especially given that it is a Friday evening. It means a lot to us. Thank you also to our co-organizers, the India International Centre Delhi, for the tech support and for ensuring a smooth, glitch-free conduct of this event. Thanks very much, everyone, for your time. Thanks a lot, Aradhya and Rahul, again. And I'll log out now. Good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.